In 1847, in a South Carolina plantation house, an enslaved midwife named Ruth held two identical baby boys, one white, one mixed race, while their mothers lay unconscious from difficult births. For 30 seconds, she stood at the crossroads of destiny, holding the power to rewrite the future with her bare hands. What she did next would fool an entire family for 18 years and prove that sometimes the greatest revolutions happen not with armies, but with a mother's love and a moment of perfect opportunity. Welcome back to Buried Truths, where we uncover the stories they buried and give voice to those they silenced. I'm about to take you into the most dangerous moment in any enslaved woman's life, childbirth, where new life meets the brutal reality of inherited bondage. This isn't just about deception. This is about what happens when maternal love meets perfect opportunity, when split-second decisions reshape destinies, and when the ultimate crime becomes the ultimate act of love. So ask yourself right now, how far would you go to save your child from a life of suffering? What laws would you break? What lies would you tell? What innocent person would you sacrifice to give your baby a chance at freedom? Keep that question burning in your heart, because by the end of Ruth's story, you'll understand exactly why some switches can never be undone. The year 1847 found the South Carolina Lowcountry drowning in rice and human misery. But on the sprawling Ashford plantation along the Ashley River, two women were about to give birth on the same sweltering August night, and only one of them would leave with the right baby. In the flickering candlelight of the plantation's birthing room, destiny was about to be decided by the steadiest hands and the most desperate heart in the entire state. Ruth wasn't just any enslaved woman. She was the plantation's master midwife, whose skilled hands had delivered more than 200 babies over 15 years of practice. Born with an intuitive understanding of childbirth that bordered on supernatural, Ruth could turn breached babies, stop hemorrhages that had killed other mothers, and coax life from situations where death seemed certain. Her reputation extended throughout the county, and even white women from neighboring plantations would request Ruth specifically when their time came. But Ruth's gift came with a curse that haunted every delivery she attended. She had brought dozens of white children safely into the world, knowing they would grow up to own people who looked like her. She had delivered enslaved babies destined for lives of bondage, their fates sealed before their first breath. Most heartbreaking of all, she had been forced to deliver her own children, knowing they would be property from the moment they were born. Ruth had given birth to 4 children over the years, and Master Ashford had sold 3 of them before their 5th birthdays. The trauma of watching her babies torn from her arms while she was expected to continue delivering other people's children with gentle care had created something dangerous inside Ruth's chest, a maternal rage so pure and focused that it had been waiting years for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came on August 23, 1847, when 2 women went into labor simultaneously in the plantation house. Mrs. Catherine Ashford, the master's wife, was delivering her first child after years of difficult pregnancies and heartbreaking miscarriages. At the same time, in the servants' quarters, Sarah, a house slave who had been raped by Master Ashford 9 months earlier, was giving birth to his illegitimate son. The cosmic irony wasn't lost on Ruth. The master's legitimate heir and his bastard slave child were being born hours apart, and she would be the one to deliver both babies. As she moved between the 2 rooms, the luxurious master bedroom with its silk curtains and mahogany furniture, and the sparse servants' quarters with its rough wooden walls, Ruth began to see possibilities that would have been unthinkable under any other circumstances. Mrs. Ashford's labor was long and difficult, complicated by her age and fragile health. She drifted in and out of consciousness from laudanum administered to manage her pain, leaving Ruth essentially alone to manage the birth. Meanwhile, Sarah's labor, though intense, progressed normally, the young woman's strong body efficiently bringing her child into the world, despite the emotional trauma of bearing her rapist's baby. Ruth delivered Sarah's baby first, a beautiful, healthy boy with light skin that could easily pass for white in dim candlelight. The child's mixed heritage was subtle enough that only someone looking carefully would notice the telltale signs of his African ancestry. Ruth held the baby for a long moment, studying his features and feeling a familiar ache as she realized this innocent child was destined for a life of slavery despite carrying his father's blood. 2 hours later, Mrs. Ashford finally delivered her son, another healthy boy. but one born with darker features that suggested some distant mixed ancestry in the Ashford bloodline. The irony was complete. The master's legitimate son looked more obviously mixed than his illegitimate slave child. As Ruth cleaned both babies in the dim candlelight, with both mothers unconscious and no other witnesses present, she found herself holding the power to rewrite two destinies with a simple exchange. The babies were similar enough in size and appearance that a switch would never be detected, especially given their mothers' altered states of consciousness. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 years, Ruth stood frozen between the two cribs she had improvised from baskets. Left hand, she held the master's legitimate son, destined for education, wealth, and the power to own other human beings. In her right hand, she held the slave child, condemned to bondage, brutality, and the constant threat of being sold away from any family he might form. The decision Ruth made in that moment wasn't just about saving one child from slavery. It was about cosmic justice, about balancing scales that had been weighted against people like her for centuries. She thought about her own 3 children, sold away, like livestock. She thought about Sarah, brutalized by the man who would now raise his own son as property. She thought about all the enslaved mothers who had watched their babies disappear into the hell of plantation life, while white children grew up in luxury built on their parents' suffering. With movements as smooth and certain as if she had practiced them her entire life, Ruth switched the babies. She placed Master Ashford's biological son in Sarah's basket, where he would be raised as a slave despite his white father's blood. She placed Sarah's son in the master's nursery, where he would grow up as the heir to one of South Carolina's largest plantations. The switch was performed with the clinical precision Ruth brought to all her medical work. She made mental notes of each baby's distinctive features, ensuring she could maintain the deception if questioned later. She adjusted their positions in their respective baskets, checked their breathing, and prepared the explanations she would give when the mothers awakened. When Mrs. Ashford regained consciousness an hour later, Ruth presented her with Sarah's son, now swaddled in the finest linens and lying in an ornate bassinet that had been prepared for months. The exhausted mother looked into the baby's face with tears of joy, seeing only the fulfillment of years of desperate longing for a child. "He's perfect," Mrs. Ashford whispered, cradling the baby she believed was her own. "He looks just like his father when he was born." Ruth nodded with a smile that hid the greatest deception in the plantation's history. "Yes, ma'am. He's a beautiful, healthy boy. Master Ashford will be so proud." Meanwhile, in the servants' quarters, Sarah awakened to find Ruth holding a baby she was told was her son. Still weak from childbirth and traumatized by the circumstances of the child's conception, Sarah accepted the infant without question. Beheld, Master Ashford's actual biological son would grow up believing himself to be a slave, never knowing he carried the blood of the man who owned him. Ruth's deception was perfect in its simplicity. No documentation existed to verify which baby belonged to which mother. The births had occurred in different rooms with no witnesses other than Ruth. Both women had been unconscious during the crucial moments when the switch was made. Most importantly, both babies were healthy. Normal infants whose switched identities would only become apparent over years of growth and development. For 18 years, Ruth's secret remained buried. The child she had placed in the master's house, Sarah's biological son, grew up as Thomas Ashford, heir to thousands of acres and hundreds of enslaved people. He received the finest education, traveled to Europe, and was groomed to take over one of the South's most prosperous plantations. Meanwhile, his actual biological son grew up as Jacob, a field slave who worked the very land he should have inherited. The psychological complexity of Ruth's position during those 18 years was staggering. She watched daily as the children she had switched grew into their assigned roles, never able to reveal the truth, but always aware of the cosmic justice she had delivered. Thomas, raised as white, developed into a surprisingly compassionate young man who questioned the morality of slavery and treated the enslaved people on his plantation with unusual kindness. Jacob, raised as enslaved, grew strong and intelligent, despite his bondage, displaying leadership qualities that made Ruth wonder if genetics could overcome environment. The irony became even more complex as Thomas began to fall in love with a free woman of color from Charleston, while Jacob showed romantic interest in one of the white overseer's daughters. Ruth watched these dangerous attractions develop, knowing that she held the secret that could either destroy or liberate both young men. The truth finally emerged in 1865, just as the Civil War was ending and slavery was being abolished. Ruth, now in her 60s and suffering from a terminal illness, decided she could no longer carry the secret alone. She called both young men to her deathbed and revealed the switch she had made 18 years earlier. The revelation shattered both men's understanding of their own identities. Thomas, who had grown up believing himself the rightful heir to the plantation, discovered he was actually the son of an enslaved woman and had no legal claim to the property he had inherited. Jacob, who had lived his entire life in bondage, learned that he was actually the legitimate son of Master Ashford, the rightful owner of the plantation where he had been enslaved. But Ruth's confession revealed something even more profound than switched identities. It exposed the arbitrary nature of the entire racial caste system that had defined Southern society. The man who had been raised as white was biologically no more white than the man who had been raised as enslaved. The heir who had received education and respect was genetically identical to the slave who had received whips and chains. Ruth's switch had proven that racial identity was a social construction with no biological basis. Thomas, faced with the loss of his assumed identity and inheritance, initially reacted with anger and disbelief. But as he processed Ruth's revelation, he began to understand the profound injustice she had tried to address. He chose to honor her deception by legally transferring ownership of the plantation to Jacob. The man he now knew was his biological brother. Jacob's response was more complex. The discovery that he was legally white and entitled to inherit vast wealth came at the cost of learning that his entire identity had been based on a lie. He had grown up hating Master Ashford, never knowing the man was his biological father. He had developed his sense of self through the struggle against oppression, and now he had to reconcile that identity with sudden privilege. Ruth died 3 days after her confession, taking with her the satisfaction of knowing she had finally balanced the scales of justice. Her funeral was attended by both young men, one who had been raised as master, one who had been raised as slave, now united in grief for the woman who had given them both a different kind of freedom. The story of Ruth's switch became legend throughout the South Carolina Lowcountry, whispered among formerly enslaved families as proof that resistance could take forms that white society never imagined. For decades after the Civil War, parents would tell their children about the midwife who had stolen a white child's destiny and given it to a slave, proving that sometimes the most powerful revolutions happened one baby at a time. The plantation where the switch occurred became a symbol of the arbitrary nature of racial hierarchy. Visitors would tour the property and hear how 2 babies born hours apart in the same house had lived completely different lives based solely on which basket they were placed in by a woman who decided that justice mattered more than law. Ruth's story also inspired a generation of black midwives throughout the South who found subtle ways to resist the system that enslaved their people. While none repeated Ruth's dramatic baby switch, many found ways to help enslaved families maintain connections, pass information, and preserve dignity during the most vulnerable moments of birth and early childhood. The psychological impact of Ruth's revelation extended far beyond the 2 men whose lives she had altered. The story forced everyone who heard it to confront uncomfortable questions about identity, inheritance, and the nature of racial categories. If 2 babies could be switched and grow up successfully in each other's predetermined roles, what did that say about the supposedly natural hierarchy that justified slavery? More importantly, Ruth's switch demonstrated the particular power that enslaved women held as midwives and caregivers. They had intimate access to the most private moments of white family life, knew secrets that could destroy reputations, and possessed skills that made them indispensable even to those who oppressed them. Ruth had used that position of trust to commit the perfect crime, one that was also the perfect act of love. The babies Ruth switched in that candlelit room represented more than just 2 individual fates. They represented the millions of African American children, whose destinies were determined solely by the circumstances of their birth. Ruth's decision to alter those circumstances, even for just 1 child, was an act of rebellion against the entire system that treated human beings as property based on arbitrary racial categories. Think about the courage required for Ruth's deception. She had to maintain perfect composure for 18 years while watching the consequences of her actions unfold. She had to serve the family whose inheritance she had stolen, While caring for the child, she had elevated to undeserved privilege. She had to watch Jacob suffer in slavery, while knowing he was legally entitled to own the plantation where he was enslaved. The moment Ruth switched those babies, she wasn't just saving one child from slavery. She was proving that the entire racial caste system was a fiction that could be undermined by anyone brave enough to act. She showed that white supremacy was so fragile that it could be destroyed by the simple act of placing the right baby in the wrong basket. When Ruth held those two newborns in her hands that August night, she was holding the future of American racial identity. Her decision to switch them was a declaration that love was more powerful than law, that justice mattered more than genetics, and that sometimes the most profound revolutions happened not on battlefields, but in birthing rooms where determined women decided to rewrite destiny. So the next time someone suggests that enslaved people never challenged the system that oppressed them, remember Ruth the midwife. Remember the woman who delivered justice along with babies, who used her position of trust to commit the most loving crime in American history, and who proved that motherhood, when armed with opportunity and courage, could be the most powerful force for change in the world. If this story has moved you, if it's shown you the hidden power that exists in moments of perfect opportunity, then I need you to do something for me right now. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because this is exactly the kind of story that Comfortable History wants to forget. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that resistance takes many forms, that love can be the ultimate weapon against injustice, and that sometimes the most powerful revolutions happen one life at a time. Leave a comment telling me what other buried truths you want me to uncover. And remember, the stories they buried are the ones that matter most, because they're the ones with the power to change how we see the world. Ruth's switch took only seconds, but its impact echoes through American history. She reminds us that identity is more fragile than we think, that justice can wear many faces, and that sometimes the most profound changes come not from destroying systems, but from quietly undermining them. One baby at a time. Until next time, keep digging for the truth, because the stories they buried are the ones we need to remember. This is Buried Truths, where we uncover the past to understand the present. The voices they silenced will be heard, and the love they tried to deny will find its way to the surface, one switch destiny at a time. Remember Ruth, remember the switch. Remember that sometimes the smallest acts of love can rewrite the largest injustices, and that motherhood, when pushed to its limits, can become the most perfect crime of all.